low ROI language learning tasks. And I'm going to basically explain in this video. If you have watched a fair bit of this channel, you know that I've talked about high ROI language learning tasks and basically things that are useful for you to actually make progress in the language you're learning. And I think something I've kind of mentioned low ROI tasks, but I haven't clearly outlined what they are. And that's because it's kind of a difficult thing to do, to list things that aren't useful, because it's basically everything that isn't a high ROI task. But I'm going to attempt to do that in this video and basically give you an idea of what things you shouldn't be wasting your time on. So the first thing and the most important thing that I think is so important to language learning that it actually applies to anything really that you can make progress in is I call it dopamine hunting. I'm not sure if that's what the internet calls it, but I'll explain what it is. So just before I get into that, low ROI tasks are anything that is really a poor investment of time or any kind of habit that reduces the ROI of tasks. So for example, something we'll talk about later is not being fully alert or paying attention when you're doing something. That in and of itself isn't a low ROI task. It's just something that reduces the ROI of a task. And if you don't know what ROI means, it literally just means return on investment. So we're looking at the return you get on different language learning tasks that you might do in regards to how much progress you make in the language that you're learning. So the number one thing I think people do that is so bad is basically, I call it dopamine hunting. So what dopamine is, if you don't know, is it's basically a hormone. It's a chemical in your brain that makes you feel good. So if you do something like, consume social media, or eat junk food, anything like that you feel kind of a desire to do, it's easy. That's because it gives you dopamine. And although it might not make you feel good in the long term, like you might feel like shit afterwards, it is kind of, it's harder to resist because it spikes your dopamine effectively. And I think what a lot of people do when they're language learning is they actually, they pursue things that give them dopamine rather than actually help them learn a language. So something I see a lot of people do is they will just consume content that's not necessarily helping them actually get better at the language. They might go through a bunch of YouTube shorts of polyglots and they will watch stuff that's designed to entertain them without actually helping them become better at the language that they're learning. And of course the result of that is that their dopamine does spike, but they're actually wasting time and they don't make progress. So nobody's perfect, obviously. I'm certainly not perfect. But yeah, this is the number one thing I see people do. Stop dopamine hunting, stop looking for things that, if you feel the desire to do something, actually ask yourself, is this going to make me progress towards my long-term goal? And if it doesn't, then you're basically only consuming it for dopamine. And if you still want to do it, fine. But I want you to understand the reality of what's actually happening. And the final thing I'll say on dopamine hunting before we talk about the rest of this video is stop living vicariously through other people. If all you want to do is consume polyglot content of other people with the skill that you want to learn, you're effectively a spectator, not an achiever, and that really isn't going to actually get you anywhere in regards to your goal. So yeah, that's everything I'll say on dopamine hunting, but I think that is the number one thing. Okay, the rest of this video, so the actual low ROI tasks and bad habits that basically reduce the ROI of tasks. So I'll start with something that wastes a lot of time. Anyone who's making physical flashcards or any other unnecessary waste of time, these are low ROI because they are basically wasting your time. Your time is the asset that you have to invest into particular tasks that are going to give you a return in the language you're learning. If you're going to do things like make physical flashcards where there is no actual benefit of making them physical, it just wastes time. It's literally wasting time. That's the long and the short of it. So you should be using digital flashcards. And I find it difficult to think of examples on the fly, but anything else, take stock of what you're actually doing to learn a language. Anything you're doing that is effectively wasting time, that doesn't have a return, should be cut out and replaced with something that is going to give you more of a return in the language you're learning. Another thing I will say is memorizing grammar with zero implementation. And the reason I say this is because this is kind of what I did at the start of learning Russian, which is really embarrassing because Russian wasn't even my second language. I'd already learned Italian and I still did this, which goes to show that everyone, Russian's my third language, by the way. It goes to show that everyone can still make progress even if they have already taught themselves a second language before, and everyone still does dumb things, myself included. So what I mean by memorizing grammar is basically, I don't have a picture, but for example, getting a notebook and learning the grammar of the language without actually doing any implementation, without actually doing an equal amount of reading and practicing the grammar rules. And actually, do you know what I mean? Like if you learn like how to conjugate verbs, for example, but you only learn the theory, then you move on to the next grammatical concept, you're not actually practicing each thing as you learn. And so you're storing the information, but it's very easy to forget because you're not actually using it. And as you know, if you've watched my video on how to actually remember things, we talk about the long-term memory. We talk about how to lock things into your long-term memory. You know that your brain basically remembers things that it judges are important. And of course, if you're not doing implementation of grammatical concepts, it's much more difficult to actually remember it, obviously. So I will say, if you're taking a lot of notes on grammar, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if you're not implementing all those things straight away, you are doing yourself a disservice because you're not remembering them as effectively as you could be. Another thing I will say, which I don't know, I'm actually not sure how common this is. Maybe you use apps a lot of the time if you are watching this video, I'm not sure. But a large time investment into apps is not a particularly good idea. So some people will completely hate on Duolingo and anything like that. I actually don't agree. And the reason I don't agree is because I think if you have watched this channel a lot, you know I think language learning is very, very important, not just for learning a language, but also because of the kind of intellectual crisis we have in this modern world with people not being able to concentrate, not having any desire to improve, etc. And I do think apps like Duolingo are very, very good. It's got like 300 million plus users. They're very, very good for bringing people into the language learning space. They're kind of a bit like a gateway drug into language learning if you think about it. So although I don't recommend doing all of your studying on Duolingo, obviously it's not a very good idea. No offense, but I do think they are a good way of bringing people into language learning. So I will say you can use the apps. Like I do personally keep a Duolingo streak just because I find it fun to do one lesson a day. If they give you motivation and if they give you a kind of structure of vocab grids to learn, if you're more of a beginner language learner, great, you can keep it. But just be aware that investing a huge amount of time doesn't get the same return as doing, 10 minutes a day, for example, just because it's not particularly useful for actually building a vocabulary particularly quickly. You're much better off using flashcards and then consuming content to actually lock those things into your brain, or speaking to a native speaker, which obviously not everyone can do, but that's another great way. So just be aware that, investing a huge amount of time into apps is not necessarily the most productive thing. Another thing I will say, and this is a habit, is unfocused deep work. So if you're not familiar with the term deep work, first I'd highly recommend you check out the book Deep Work by Dr. Cal Newport. It's a very, very good book. I have read most of it, I think. I haven't read the very end of it, but it is basically talks about the difference between deep work and shallow work. I'll define it really quickly, and apologies if it's not 100% accurate, but shallow work is basically tasks you can do while distracted, for example, chores, just kind of like routine tasks, checking emails, things that don't require a large amount of, they don't require a lot of attention, they don't carry a large cognitive load, whereas deep work tasks are things that require a lot of attention. They're very intellectually stimulating and they require focus. For example, making these videos or studying a language are examples of deep work tasks. So the thing a lot of people do, which is really bad, is they apply a shallow work kind of unfocused work ethic to deep work tasks, which basically results in them not getting as high of a return. So you can imagine if you're doing a deep work task like writing a book, for example, and you're distracted, checking emails, getting notifications, sleep deprived or whatever, you are not going to be able to be as productive with that deep work task. Same goes for language learning or anything, simply because you're not as focused. So I will say a lot of people are completely unfocused when it comes to doing language learning and that kind of thing. They have a wandering mind, and this is one of the really big problems of the modern world, and it's damaging for language learning because of course you're doing a very complicated and tricky thing trying to understand a high quantity of completely unknown information. So you do need to be focused, and I would recommend you check out my video. I have it pop up on the screen right now of how to focus better on language learning. But that is one problem. Another problem is being non-alert. I don't think this is as much of a problem. By alert, I basically mean not drowsy. I suppose if you are waking up and then doing a language learning task immediately, and you're not a morning person, you might be a bit drowsy. Also, I guess if you're pushing your language learning tasks to right at the end of the day when you're drowsy and not as alert, that's potentially not getting you as high of a return. But the main focus of that point is unfocused deep work. It's not as good. The next thing would be low confidence with speaking. I've already made a video on this as well. And my opinion, I'll just give it to you quickly, is that whenever you meet someone who speaks the foreign language you're learning, even if it's day one and you know how to say hello and that's it, tell them you're learning the language and try and say something, because that will actually build your confidence with speaking, and you'll feel better afterwards. Sometimes you'll feel nervous before, but then you do it anyway, and then afterwards you feel great because you did something that you were nervous to do. So that's my opinion on that. Always take advantage of it. Imagine you have to. You can hire teachers online, right? You can pay to talk to someone in a foreign language. I want you to basically visualize that every time you meet someone who speaks the language you're learning, it's like free teacher, effectively. Even if they're not teaching you, you have the opportunity to practice speaking with them. So yeah. And the next thing I will say, which probably doesn't deserve to be at the bottom, it should be higher, is not problem solving. So if you imagine the language learning process, we're fixing the big problem of you not being able to speak the language by conquering little problems, like you don't know this vocab group, you don't understand this grammar rule, you can't pronounce this properly, you don't know the alphabet, etc. We're just going through and fixing micro problems along the way. That's why I've compared language learning to acquiring micro skills. So the thing that's interesting is a lot of people don't actually problem solve. Whenever they encounter a problem in a language, like I remember trying to understand clitic pronouns in Italian. Didn't make sense to me at the start when I did that. If you don't speak Italian, that probably won't make sense to you. But yeah, just difficult things that they don't actually try and problem solve. So what I want you to do from now on, whenever you encounter something in a language you don't understand, is to basically get a pen and paper, write down what the problem is, circle it, draw a line, draw like an arrow to the solution, which is you being able to understand whatever it is. So you would write, for example, not understanding the alphabet, draw a line with an arrow, understanding the alphabet, and then basically pretend you're like 50% stupid, or what would be the solution? Obviously, in that example, the solution would just be to memorize the alphabet, and then you ask yourself basic one-word questions. Okay, memorize the alphabet, how? Flashcards, when, now, why? Because this is the only way for me to understand that. And then boom, you've basically got your solution. If it's something more complicated, like for example, I don't understand this grammatical rule, obviously the ideal scenario that you'd be drawing an arrow to is you understand this grammatical rule. And then you ask yourself the same one-word questions. How do I do that? I'll memorize it. How? I need to actually read what it is for the first time. How? Okay, I need to find a website or a YouTube video explaining it. How? I need to search for one. And then boom, you've basically got your solution reverse built. You just search up the problem on YouTube, you watch a video, you understand it for the first time, and then you actually memorize it, then you implement it, etc. That is how you solve problems. And I think most people, including myself looking back, haven't actually done this, and they make things way more complicated than they need to be. So yeah, that is the last thing. The bottom line is to invest your time into productive things like targeting specific vocab groups through flashcards and input, studying specific grammar, reinforcing it with content, etc., problem solving. And a lot of people don't do this, which is why they spend their time pursuing low ROI tasks and not getting the return that they actually want. But yeah, that is the video, guys. If you are interested in learning a language, check out the Language Learning Accelerator in the description. I've also got a link to my Discord, and I'd highly recommend you subscribe. But yeah, thank you for watching, and have a good one.